Whoop, guess what? It's time for another episode of Ask Boston Sax. I'm your host, Jack Tyler, and today we'll be discussing whether or not you could be saving money on your car insurance. Hey Jack, do you think that mouthpiece material makes a difference? Well, this reminds me of a question that we answered in the very first episode about the finish on saxophones making a difference in how they sound. We have to remind ourselves that while the mouthpiece does to some degree vibrate, and we can maybe feel that behind the horn, that doesn't actually have anything to do with how it projects. So that being said, there's always been this stigma that a metal mouthpiece versus a hard rubber mouthpiece will be brighter. And I think a lot of that has to do with just the fact that they look shiny. And my theory really comes down to the fact that most metal saxophone mouthpieces have a very different profile. If you make a metal saxophone mouthpiece out of brass especially, the exact same dimensions externally as a hard rubber mouthpiece, it's going to be really, really heavy. Like heavy to the point where it could damage the neck on your horn, which is why most companies, predominantly Auto Link, styled them much smaller. And my theory has always been that when you play a metal mouthpiece that has a smaller profile, a smaller beak profile, you have to change your embouchure, right? You have to tighten things up, which inherently is going to speed up your airflow, which is why I think that naturally we have a tendency to play a little bit brighter on a metal mouthpiece. Now, I've had the really unique experience of designing my own mouthpieces for Boston Sax Shop, and when we prototype them, we make them in 3D printed plastic and PLA. And then after that, once we approve the mouthpiece, we make them out of hard rubber. And I've even experimented with using anodized aluminum and brass. So I have done something that not a lot of people have gotten to do, which is essentially played the exact same mouthpiece, which has been CNC machined. So there's very, very little room for any tolerance differences, out of different materials, but with all the internal dimensions the same facing curve, the same window, the same tip width. And I got to tell you that behind the horn, they all felt very different, but in front of the horn, they essentially all sounded exactly the same. So if someone is marketing to you that the material of the mouthpiece is going to make a huge difference in how it's going to sound, especially to an audience or to a microphone, you should probably start shopping somewhere else. Hey Jack, how important is it to have the body soldered to the bow of the saxophone? This is a good question because most modern manufacturers do not solder the body to the bow. And the bow is that macaroni piece on the bottom of the horn, just so we all know what we're talking about. A lot of vintage horns, including most Mark 6s after a certain period of time, these were all soldered together. And the benefit of solder is it's a stronger connection, it's more rigid, it's going to be a lot less likely to leak over time because you want that junction to be absolutely watertight, so that you're not losing any air pressure when you're playing. Now the downside is, God forbid, you have to remove the body from the bow. And the only reason you'd really need to do it is if it took a really big fall, had a lot of significant body damage, and it would just be a lot easier to fix that by removing the two pieces from each other. If you have to do that, you have to use a certain amount of heat, which can potentially damage the lacquer. Mainly just a cosmetic thing, but it's still a pain in the ass to do and do perfectly. Now, a lot of modern companies, what they're doing is putting an epoxy-based glue around those two joints, which is a lot easier to remove with a solvent, but the downside being that it's not as rigid a connection and it can potentially leak over time. We have a lot of Selmers that will come in from the 1990s where that glue is basically deteriorated and there could potentially be a leak in the joint. So overall, I would say it's better to have it soldered. There's going to be people out there that also claim that it has a sonic property to it, whether it's soldered or not. I don't believe in that whatsoever. But just from a purely mechanical, physical perspective, I think having the bow and the body soldered is a better move. Hey Jack, I'm considering having my Selmer Mark 6 restored and I'm wondering what resonators should I use, plastic or metal? All right, so this actually brings up a bigger question, which I'm not going to get into fully right now because we will be here literally all day, which is, do the resonators make any difference in the sound? I just want to remind you to think objectively and remember that you can't just change the resonator. You got to change a whole bunch of other shit too. You got to change the pads, key heights. I mean, if you're going to change all the resonators on your saxophone, you've got to overhaul it. So there's so many other factors that are involved that to pin the changes just on the resonators is a little foolish, even though of course it's something that we can see with our eyes, which, naturally we want to put, the blame on that. But that being said, as per your question, there was a switch at the 80,000 serial number range on a Mark 6 between metal resonators, which were called Tonex resonators, which are a nickel-plated seamless brass, to plastic resonators, which were screwed into the back of the pads. Why did Selmer do this? To save money. There's no big mystery here. It wasn't to shape the tone of the saxophone or that it was any kind of improvement. It's simply just a lot cheaper to make plastic resonators, which is why they did it. So armed with that knowledge, I just suggest going with what was originally in the instrument because I'm a nut for trying to keep things as they were. So if it's pre-80,000, go with metal, again, seamless nickel-plated brass. And if it's after 80,000, I would just use plastic.